Congratulations, if you're watching this video, you probably just received an offer to purchase your home that you are selling. And you're in a great position. It's an exciting time, a lot of emotions in this time, but very exciting nonetheless. In this video, we're gonna be covering what are the contingencies that you need to be aware of when you're receiving that offer, so that when you sign that contract, you're aware of how ultimately either A, the buyer can negotiate or potentially back out of a deal based on the contingencies that they wrote in their offer. Of course, if you get an offer without any of these contingencies, that's probably the best offer to take as long as it meets the pricing and financial goals that you have in selling that property. So be aware of these contingencies as you review your offer. So let's get started. The first contingency is one that most sellers are aware of. It's called the inspection contingency. And in Texas, the buyer has an option period in which they can send out an inspector to the property, look at the condition of the property, and come back with a report of that condition of that property. And during that time, they can choose to either A, request for repairs to be made to the property, or B, reduction in price, or then finally C, just back out of the deal altogether. So in this scenario, the buyer has a smaller amount of money tied up in an option period. It's commonly maybe a couple $100s here or there. And then the seller has, of course, a smaller period of time in which their property is locked up if the buyer is not serious about going through with the property or they're not willing to make the changes that the buyer is requesting, right? It gives both parties a good opportunity to evaluate whether it's good to go forward based on the condition of the property. The second contingency is the appraisal contingency. And in the appraisal, it does not get ordered typically until the inspection is done or that option period is done. The lender wants to know, hey, buyer, are you serious about this property or not, before they order an appraisal. So an appraiser is going to go out, their interest is to protect the bank and to protect the lender, to make sure that the lender is not making a loan that is maybe too high on a property that's just not worth enough. So they need to protect the bank's interests. An appraisal contingency is an offer that says, hey, I'm willing to buy the house, but I need it to appraise for X amount of dollars. If it doesn't appraise for X amount of dollars, then I have the option to back out. And again, I get to keep that earnest money that I put in with my offer, right? So this is important to understand when you're reviewing the appraisal contingency. It's found in Texas in the financing addendum to the contract, and the conditions are outlined in there. There is an option for a buyer to sweeten the conditions here and say, hey, it's not contingent on the appraisal of the property, but they would need to add an additional addendum to the contract in order to clarify that they're going to move forward either way, right? So what happens here is basically the bank sends out the appraisal. Let's just say the purchase price is $200,000. I know it's hard to find a house for that, but simple math. If it's coming in at $200,000, the appraiser comes back and says, oh, nope, it's actually worth $195,000, right? There's a couple things that could happen here in this scenario. Either A, the seller agrees to reduce the price to the $5,000 and the transaction goes forward, or B, the seller doesn't agree to reduce that price. In that case, there's two scenarios here. Either A, the buyer can back out, or B, the buyer can cough up an extra $5,000 in cash and bring the difference in cash. So ultimately the lender doesn't care because it's not their money at stake, it's the buyer's money at stake, right? So the transaction can still go forward. Just understand that it will be a point of negotiation likely if that contingency comes up. Okay, number 3, we get the financing contingency. So not only does the property need to appraise for the value, but the buyer also needs to qualify. So if you see this financing contingency, it's also found in Texas, the financing addendum that goes along with the contract, then that means that the buyer is saying, hey, I need to also get approval from my bank to go forward with this transaction. So we've most likely already received an offer saying, hey, they're either pre-qualified or pre-approved to purchase this home. That's good. That means the bank has at least looked at their income. They're looking at their debt to income ratios and so on and so forth. And on paper, it looks like they are going to be good to go forward. But during the period when you're actually going past the option period, the bank starts to do some kind of digging into the buyer's financial situation, their credit report, their history, all sorts of things. And they may ask for several documents. So the buyer in this case is saying, hey, I need my bank to go through the entire due diligence and financially approve me to move forward, right? If that doesn't happen, then they would have the option again to back out, right? And that's usually found, typically in Texas between 15 to 25 days is what's common to see on those contracts there to get approval for the buyer. And number 4, we have the title contingency. So with the title contingency, we're looking at basically, does the seller have free and clear title to sell this property, right? And most of the time, we don't have any issues that come up here because you're selling the property, you're aware of the situations. Things that might cause hiccups here is if you have liens on the property, let's just say a mechanic's lien that you weren't aware of, or potentially a dispute on who owns the property. And that usually only happens when there is a death in the family and that property is inherited. So there's really 2 paths when a property is inherited to go through, and that's either it goes through a probate court, and in that case the judge assigns who has the rightful ownership of the property and what equity and the percentage and the split, so on and so forth. And option number 2 is an affidavit of heirship in Texas, which is basically a shortened way of distributing the heirship of that property, and it only qualifies for people who do not have a will. So if you have a will, it's going to go through the probate process and assign the distribution of the ownership of the property. If they don't have a will in the family, then it would go through the affidavit of heirship. And there's several rules in Texas about who has rightful ownership of this. So if, for example, you got in there assuming that maybe you had the full ownership and there's maybe a half sister somewhere that doesn't have any, and then all of a sudden, per the rules of Texas, they do, then you would need to figure that out with that, again, that relative to ultimately go through with that sale. So if you weren't able to give them free title, that would be the way that they back out. So again, you as a seller, you're gonna know the situation here. This isn't one really that the buyer is gonna just back out and surprise you with. This is ultimately you're providing them free title or free and clear title with the sale of the property. And number 5, we have the sale of another property, right? This is a contingency that could be added in for somebody. Let's just say they are moving, they're upsizing a house for an extra kid that they have now in their family, and they need to sell their house in order to purchase your house because they need the cash from that sale in order to fund this one, right? And in that case, they can write a contingency in their offer that states that, hey, I must sell this house in order to go through with this transaction. If they write that, it's good to see that that house is at least pending, and ideally they're past their option period. So if we can ask a few questions typically from the agent that is representing them as a buyer to understand where they are in that process. Have they gone through some of these other contingencies that could mess up the sale of their property? Then ultimately that gives us a better peace of mind that they're going to be able to go forward, and maybe you accept this offer even though it has that contingency on there, right? So just be aware that if their sale does not go through, then it might impact the sale of your property as well if you accept an offer with a home sale contingency. Another contingency frequently seen is the HOA contingency. And in this case, it's basically saying, hey, I want to review what the HOA has in terms of rules and so on and so forth, and then I have a certain amount of time to accept those rules. So typically a title company will order the HOA documents and so on and so forth and send those to the buyer. The buyer has time to review that. They might review this if, for example, they want to build maybe a backyard of some sort, and for some reason the HOA just has specific rules against what they were wanting to do with the property, right? So again, less common that someone backs out for HOA, but it is a contingency that you need to be aware of. If it is written in the contract, maybe it's worth asking, why do they need that, right? And then last of all, this is less common, especially in residential here in Texas, in a city like Houston or Katy, but you might see an environmental contingency more frequently out in the country where you have a little bit more space. Maybe you have rivers, ponds, sewage, so on and so forth that are just not being handled normally like they might be in the city. So they might add in a contingency on there as well for environmental to either fix certain things or have certain things audited. Let's just say they have a wetland area and they want to understand what the government may require if that's developed or continued out there. They might want to have better documentation or understanding of what's happening in the property in that situation, right? So again, these are the 7 contingencies that are most commonly seen here in Texas. It doesn't mean that all of the contingencies are in your contract. It's important that when you receive a contract or multiple contracts, that you're evaluating several things. A, price. Does it meet your financial terms that you're wanting to hit, your goal that you're wanting to hit? And then B, what is the likelihood it's going to go through? So for example, if you receive two offers that are the exact same price, but one of them has more contingencies than the other, then it's going to be better for you to accept an offer that has less contingencies. And this can be a point of negotiation too, just asking, hey, can you submit an offer with the same price, but remove this contingency, etc., right? So again, inspection, quality of the home, appraisal, the value of the property, protecting the bank ultimately and their values, and then financing, the buyer getting approval to purchase, title, you're giving the free and clear title to your buyer ultimately. The home sale, this is the buyer has a house that they need to sell in order to purchase your home. HOA, ultimately rules that the HOA has, and do they accept that? And then last of all, environmental, right? So these are the contingencies to be walking through with your real estate agent, understanding the timelines as it impacts your decision to pack up, to move, all of those things, and be communicating along the way here as you cross the bridges. So understand the times, understand the contingencies, and help you negotiate. We'll see you guys at the closing table.